What is the scariest thing you've ever seen in your life that you can't explain?
Number 1, brought home a 3-foot-tall realistic doll my grandparents had, with the intention of fixing it up. I'm scared of dolls, so I put it in a box and put a heavy metal box on top of it.
Next morning the doll was gone.
The boxes were still in place, but the damn thing had disappeared completely.
I live in fear.
Number 2, about 25 years ago, my now former wife and I were caretaking a house. We had been there for several weeks and we both noticed that we always had that feeling coming up the stairs from the cellar that something was going to grab you as soon as you turned the light switch off.
Everything else about the house was normal. We slept with an analog wind-up alarm clock next to the bed, the kind that actually ticks. To set the alarm, you move a tiny third hand to the location on the clock face for the desired time. For example, halfway between 6 and 7 to awaken at 6:30. It's a physical process and there is very little way to get it wrong.
We always had the clock set to wake us up at 6 a.m. It was not something we fiddled with on a daily basis. One night, the alarm clock went off at like 2 in the morning.
Old school ringing bells. Both my former wife and I woke up absolutely terrified.
I saw a small figure maybe 2 feet tall run out of the room.
I thought I must have been crazy until my former wife screamed, "Did you just see that thing?" We both described it as some sort of small gremlin. When we looked at the alarm clock, we saw that the alarm hand had been moved from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. That's the whole story. Scared the fuck out of me. Have no explanation for it. Nothing else ever happened there, but the cellar feeling persisted.
Number 3, working in a nursing home for years during the night and everyone always complained of weird stuff like noises on the top floor.
I never believe in any of that, so I was always the one going upstairs to do night checks.
One night I was changing a resident on that floor with a colleague and my colleague complained he heard something like people walking. We were in the resident room and I had to go to the cupboard at end of that corridor to get bedsheets, and when I was coming back with the bedsheets I kept hearing steps and like if someone was touching and opening plastic bags. I was so annoyed and looked outside the room and saw a shadow passing the corridor. The issue is that the shadow was so big, like if literally a person just passed by, along with step noises and plastic bags. I freak out so badly and froze completely. I had to call another colleague to come upstairs because I was so scared of coming out of the resident room. Bear in mind that I do not believe in those things, and for 2 years I was always the one doing night checks on the top floor and bottom floor on my own.
Never had any problem and never saw something.
Since that day I never went upstairs alone and was always very scared.
Number 4, once I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open.
I could see the outline of someone standing there, but when I turned on the light, there was no one there. The door was still slowly closing, as if whoever or whatever had been there was leaving. Even creepier, my Nest fire alarm had illuminated in the corridor, sensing movement, but there was nobody there.
Still gives me chills thinking about it.
Number 5, so in college I studied in the UK. I lived in a house with a group of other American students that had stories of the ghost of a girl who passed away while living there. I never believed in any of it, but it was fun to play along. The kitchen had one way in and out, and right after you entered the kitchen to your right was a padlocked door to the cellar where she allegedly lived.
I had the only key.
We were all a little homesick near Thanksgiving, so decided to do a meal together. This required some creative cooking schedules due to small appliances in the kitchen, so one girl who didn't have class the next day offered to stay up late to get the turkey going. We went into the cellar the first, and only, time that evening to get larger cooking implements. At 2:04 in the morning, I wake up to my door rattling, like someone was pushing against it. I assumed it was a housemaid who just went to the wrong door. About 30 seconds later, when I hear a scratchy female voice softly saying hello, every 5 seconds or so. My window was open, and it sounded like it was coming from outside, so I get up to close my window as I assume it's some drunk girl walking back from the pub. I get to the window, and there's no one there, and then I hear hello, clear as a bell behind me. My door rattles again, and goes silent. I've had night terrors before, and hallucinate when I have even a mild fever, so I assume I'm still asleep and lay back down. The next morning at 7 a.m., the girl who's cooking tells me I had the creepiest night. At 1:50 I heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs, then the door rattled. Then at 2:10 the door rattled again and I heard footsteps coming down. She told me this before I had said anything to anyone about what I'd experienced. Number 6, when I was 9 years old I was biking home in the evening. We lived in the countryside up a small mountain. The road from the village was an uphill, a flat section and then another uphill. The road lights only stretched to the end of the flat section. I was a bit afraid of the dark, so I stopped at the end of the road lights just at the bottom of the last uphill to gather courage to bike the last section home. It was a partial moon so it wasn't pitch black, and at the end of the uphill I saw a figure walking down towards me. I thought I'd wait until she got closer as I would feel less afraid to bike in the dark if there was someone else close. But about halfway down the hill the person walked into a thin shadow of a tree on the road and never came back out. Just disappeared. I stood there for a while trying to figure out what I just saw and then panicked and biked down to the village and stayed there until my parents came driving and wondered why I never came home. They tried to explain it with stuff like the person might have gone into the woods or something. What they didn't disclose though, out of fear that I'd never dare to bike home again, was that my father had seen the same thing walking home from work. He had seen her clear as day, walking down the hill for a while. When he looked down for just a second and looked up she was gone, and there were no footsteps in the fresh snow. I later read a book about local legends, and apparently a lot of people during at least a century have seen her walking down the hill and disappearing halfway down. My youngest daughter loved the story, so we've been on ghost stakeouts, where we buy pizzas and snacks and hang out at the bottom of the hill, listening to the Ghostbusters theme song and try to see the ghost. Number 7, I live in the countryside and when I was a kid, every day I used to go check the chickens that we had in a henhouse in the garden. It was around 8 p.m. in the winter, dark and snow everywhere. I put my shoes on and went outside. Everything went as usual, until I saw it. There was somebody standing in front of me in the dark. Or like. I wish it was somebody. That figure was almost 3 meters tall and had red glowing eyes. I told my parents and until this day nobody believes me. Few years ago I found out the previous owner of our house committed suicide in the same place in our garden years before we moved in. Number 8, I was riding my bike down a rural road when I was 9 and found a garbage bag filled with red sludge and white sticks. I thought it was blood and bones, but I had a very PG childhood and I had never even seen pretend blood and bones, so I had nothing to compare to. I told myself it wasn't what I thought it was. After all, why would there be a ripped open garbage bag filled with blood and bones? 2 days later I thought look again, and if it is what you think it is, tell a grown-up. I biked back to the area and it was gone. I am now old and have watched enough to confirm, it was blood and bones. Number 9, living in kind of a beat-up neighborhood in the early 2000s. My house had an alleyway behind it and one night around 3 a.m. I heard the weirdest sound, like laughing but also moaning. I looked out my window and saw the elderly man standing under a street lamp just staring up at my window. It freaked me the fuck out. He finally kept walking down the alleyway but man, I never looked out that window at night again. Number 10, as a kid there was a camp that had a lean-to and an old plywood caravan against it a long way out in the AUS bush from the town I grew up in. One school holidays my friends and I went for a bushwalk and stumbled across it. Didn't look like anyone had been there in months and we looked in the van nothing much but moldy seats and a built-in table, usual old caravan stuff so we shut the door because it smelt moldy. As we sat in the shade of the lean-to we heard the doorknob squeak and start turning. Pretty sure my backpack is still sitting there 35 years later because I dropped it and ran. We all scattered in different directions and met up lower down the road an hour later and we were all still pale. No way anyone was in that van. No way. Still bothers me to this day.